Hi everyone, it's Jeanette here from the Sewing Studio with a start on a new scrap quilt. Now I know I can hear you all out there saying, but Jeanette, you're not supposed to be starting a new scrap quilt, you're supposed to be finishing your pineapple blocks. And please be assured, pineapple blocks are still going ahead, we are still working on them. But I thought I would start this project today because I inherited a load of somebody else's scraps. And I was very grateful for them. That sounded like I wasn't being, but I was very grateful for them. But rather than all going into my stash, I wanted to sort of use them quite quickly rather than it bulking up my stash. So that was one of my justifications to myself. Probably the second justification was, I can't wait to start a new scrap quilt. So that sort of got the better of me. But the sort of final thing really was, I'm using this as a bit of a leader and ender project. So I'm sewing bits and parts and pieces of this and cutting bits and parts and pieces in between doing other things. And I can't really do that with my pineapple blocks. You know, I need to sort of focus a bit more on the pineapple blocks. So having fully justified me starting a new scrap quilt, I've gone ahead and actually it's going really well. It's a lot of fun and things are coming together really quickly. So what I've done here today is I've brought in some of the scraps that I was actually given. And I thought, rather than just talking about the blocks and what I'm doing, I would really take it right back to what I do when I got given some scraps or when I'm sorting through my own scraps. And the first thing I always do is I go through and I pull them and I begin to put them into groups of colour. So I'm just going to grab this because I've done that bit because I did that as soon as these scraps sort of came into my house really. And I think these are all blue. So that's my whole blue or something that will work with blue. So these have got bits of blue in. So if I put that whole messy bit, oh, that's a bit of an interloper there, look. But that's sort of what would go into, typically what would go into a blue stack. Now, the other thing I do when I'm sorting through the scraps is I take out anything which isn't suitable to go into a quilt. So it might be a fabric that's very thin or a fabric where the colour might bleed, or a fabric that's got a different weave if it's more of a craft cotton rather than a quilting cotton, or a very loose weaved blend for it. I tend to set those aside. Now I'm quite realistic is actually, am I going to use any of those things? And if the fabrics sometimes are really thin, I don't. They do go into fabric recycling. Or if it's a fabric that's going to be really problematical with the colour running, it's like, do you know what? Sometimes it's just not worth it. That will go into recycling. But some of the craft cottons, some of the looser weaves, I can use in my slow stitching, I can use elsewhere, I can use in a craft project. So I tend to hold on to them and I've got a sort of like what I call my sort of play box of fabrics that I keep those in. So I'm really just going through and looking for the fabrics that I would want in a quilt, that I would want to put into a quilt. So I arrange them by colour or by colour theme. So if I'm finding a lot of browns and oranges and yellows, I might start making a bundle, which is like, oh, that could be something I could do for an autumnal quilt. Or if there's a lot of Christmas, obviously reds and greens, they're Christmas fabrics, I'll put them together in the theme of Christmas. Or if it's a lot of pastels, they're all pastel. So I won't necessarily say, well, that's pink and that's green and that's purple. It's all pastels, it will all work together. So I'm just beginning to, in my mind, put them into groups where then I can begin to work with them and they're all going to play nicely together. And by doing that, I find it's less overwhelming. For ages, I probably made the same mistake as we all made. I just put all the scraps into one container and then one day I would go, oh, I'm going to do something with my scraps. I would get it out and I would feel uninspired and overwhelmed because there was just so much in there. So just doing that mental process of sorting through just makes it a lot easier for me to deal with. Now, I don't tend to sort by size, but I do take note of the sizes that are in there. So in this one, as you can see, there were lots of 2.5 inch wide strips and there were lots of pieces that looked like this. So that's now beginning to tell me the sorts of things I might be able to make with it. Now in the scraps that I got given, like I said, this is just a small part. There was a lot of blue, there was a lot of red, there was a lot of browns, and there was a little bit of green. And I thought I can work with all of that. All of those colours will go together. So that's what I've been doing and that's the colour combination we're going to be doing, and I'll show you the block in a minute. So I'll just show you the rest of the sorts of things that were in the scraps that I was given. So this I've put together in red. Now I did have pieces like this and it's just like, actually I would never put those colours together. That's going to take a little bit of work for me to unpick those seams, but I'll do it, but not right now because they really aren't the colours that I'm looking for in this particular quilt. So that one would probably get set aside. But I had parts and pieces like this in there, sort of partly made blocks that, once again, I can't see I'm going to use that as a block. So I will unpick those seams and use the fabrics as separate fabrics. There might be other bits here. You can see somebody was doing some nice strip piecing and cutting. Those, once again, are going to need a little bit more work. So for the moment, I would set those aside, and when I've got a bit more time in front of the TV or something, I will just sit there with my unpicker and begin to sort of use those. So that's just to give you an idea of where to start. So if you've got this sort of things in your scrap pile, just go through and just make something that makes sense to you, colours, sizes, just so you can see what you can work with and perhaps have an idea of what might all work together nicely. Now I'll just show you this final bit, which I don't know quite what to do with, is a finished block. The fabric in the centre isn't to my taste, so I'm not quite sure, but for the moment, I'm not going to worry about this. I'm just going to set it aside. I've got a container that has sort of orphan blocks. They'll call that an orphan block, where it's just all one on its own. So I'll probably put it in there and then decide at a later stage what I'm going to do with it if I do anything at all. I may decide not to do anything at all. So I hope you found that useful. So that was the first thing, going through scraps. So let me just put those away because I don't need those anymore, but I am going to look at the blues. Now the other thing I realised is there's quite a lot of fabric there, but I may need to add something from my own stash. So I went through, I needed more green. So my first sort of sift, if you like, is I pulled out some more greens from my stash. Where they were. There's a bit of a red there as well that will get cut down. I also had a look at my scrappy 2.5-inch square box. Is there anything in there that might work? So I've pulled some of those. And I've also got a container with parts of 5-inch squares, charm squares. So I've pulled those in the colours that I'm using because I may need to go into those as well. But I'm going to try and use all these scrap first and then bring these in as and when I need to. So let's set those aside. So having got a good sort through, pulled some stuff from my scraps, sort through the scraps I was given, I then need to decide what block I'm going to make. And because of the pieces like this that were in there, because I had a lot of these in all the colours, so somebody was doing a lot of quilts using either braids or some other half square triangles maybe. I had a lot of pieces that looked like that, so I thought, right, I need a pattern that uses squares and half square triangles because that will make the best use of the fabrics I've got here. So I came across a block, and the only name I can find for this block is a variation on a split 9 patch. It's not what I would term a split 9 patch. Now I'm going to put this under the close-up because this is the blocks that I have been making. And it looks very similar to lots of other blocks. It looks a little bit like a contrary wife, but it's not quite. And it looks a little bit like a Jacob's ladder, but it's not quite. So I'm going to call it the split 9 patch variation because I can't actually find another name for it. I did look in my Barbara Brackman and she doesn't have it in there. So yeah, if anybody knows what that block is actually called, do put it in the comments because I really would like to know. I've been trying to research it for quite a while there, trying to find what it is. So this is the block we're going to make. So from it you can see I used 2.5-inch squares and 2.5-inch half square triangles. The block needs 3 light 2.5-inch squares, 2 medium and dark 2.5-inch squares and 4 half square triangles. So knowing that now, I've decided on my block. I did a little test block and I'm then going to pull in this little basket and I'm going to put this in under the close-up and hopefully you can sort of see down into that because this is now where I'm keeping all my little bits of fabric. This is my organisation of it, and it means this sits next to my sewing machine at home, and it means that any time if I've got a spare 10 minutes or a spare half an hour, I can either cut some pieces and add it, or I can be working on it. So let's go through what's in here. So the biggest stack by far, so far in here, are 2.5-inch squares. And these I've cut from the scraps that I was given. I don't think I've added any of my own 2.5-inch squares to that. So that is by far the biggest pile. However, I've decided I'm going to do 48 of these blocks and there's only 2 needed for each of those. So I'm actually only going to need 96 of those, but some of those could go to half square triangles at a later stage. But for the moment, I'm keeping those 2.5-inch squares. This now is my little stack of lights. And for each block, you need 3 of those. So my math says 3 times 48 is 144. So I'm going to need 144. Well, we can see I'm going to need more of those, aren't I? So let's put those back in. And then half square triangles, I've got my darks and mediums, and I've got my half square triangles from my lights that I'm sewing together, and they're in the box. So as I cut them, I just add to the piles. And then there's 2 more bits in here, finished half square triangles. Now there's 4 needed for each block. So I'm going to need, and I'm going to look here because I can't remember, a total of 192 of those for the whole 48 blocks. So I've got some way to go on those, but I have got some blocks done already. And then there is another pile in here, and this is, I don't quite know what to do with those. These are a funny sort of shade of fabric. They're not quite dark or a medium, and they're not quite light. So every time I've tried to place them in the block, they sort of blur the line between where the separate elements are. So for the moment, I'm not worrying about them. I'm just putting them as a separate little stack in my little container. If it does work somewhere, I can use them. If it doesn't, they're ready to go for another project. So I'm just going to put my little basket under there again so you can sort of see, and that's where it all lives. So as I'm cutting, that's where all the pieces are. I take that to my sewing group. So if I've got a bit of time at the end of the day, if I've finished all the sewing I've taken with me, I can work on these. I can cut, I can sew, I can make half square triangles. And that's the bits I'm using as my leader and ender, making the half square triangles. So enough chatter, but I wanted to explain all of that so that you see the whole process, not just the sewing bit. Right, so there's my piece of fabric. So you can either grab this ruler, and this is my multi-size, this is a 45 and 90 degree ruler from Creative Grids, and it's this top part I would use, but I will bring in this one because it's much smaller. It's the folded corner clipper, and I've shown you this before when I've done binding, but it's also really good for cutting half square triangles, and it's also perfect for this because of the size. It just fits in my little basket, so it just works really well for that. So all I'm going to do, and I'll do it with this smaller ruler, is put, this is already 2.5 inches, so I don't need to cut this down into a strip. And I'll just go through and cut my parts and pieces. And I'm going to tidy up that edge because it probably wasn't completely square. And that's a half square triangle. Now from this bit, I've got a decision to make. I can either get a 2.5 inch square, so actually with this one, let's do that. But we've already got a big stack of half squares, 2.5 inch squares. So we can either do that. Let's just grab another one of these. Do the same again. Let's just do that. Let's cut our half square triangle. Well, that one's a bit straighter on the edge, so I should only need to do 1 cut. Now with this one, because I know I need more half square triangles cut, I'm actually going to turn this into another half square triangle. But we are going to lose that bit there. So that bit isn't going to be big enough for another half square triangle, but that can go into my half square triangle. But I'm not going to throw that away because I can do a scrappy triangle with that one. So no scrap gets wasted in my house. So those then can go into my box, that can go onto that pile, and that can go onto my 2.5 inch squares. So that's how I'm going through and cutting and stacking them and having them all there neat and ready for me to use. Right, now we're going to have a look at how we're going to put the block together because we're getting our pieces. So let me just tidy my work surface, put that somewhere where I don't throw it away, and pull these in. So these are my blocks, and I haven't long started them, and I've already made 20, so they're going pretty fast. As I said, I'm making units and I'm making the blocks in between sewing other things. So we need to do half square triangles. So let's pull out our 2 bits from our half square triangles here, and all I'm going to do is just match up a light with a medium and a dark. Now at home I have these on I've got a sewing desk that has a sort of fold down flap to my right, so I just have these 2 stacks and I can just sort of pick them up and send them through. And let's just pick another one. Let's grab one of these reds and let's grab one of that just for a bit of variety. So let's just put a few together and then we will take them to the machine and sew. Let's grab a green. or brown. There we are, brown's come. Let's do that one with that. Now I'm being a bit picky here, but generally I just go through the whole stack. So that's the principle. So just pair up your darks with your lights, and then we'll take those to the machine and sew. So because we've got really narrow points here, I'm going to start on my starter scrap. I've had questions for that before. Why does Jeanette, you know, what's that little piece of fabric Jeanette sews on? And literally we're just going to chain piece these through. And all that means is we feed one in after the other without cutting the thread in between. Now, rather than cutting the thread there, I'm going to leave that one under the machine, because then that's the equivalent of me starting on a starter scrap. So I'm ready to sew again next time I come back to the machine. And as I'm working on this block, we can just keep going. So on these, I'm just going to take off these little dog ears. And then what I tend to do when I'm chain piecing these is I just make a stack like that. And then when I've got a lot, I take that all to the iron and do that. But we'll do that in a minute when we come to do the block. So let's go back into our little basket and let's pull out, I'm actually going to put those over by the machine because I'm going to show you something as I'm sewing. So we're going to lay out the block now. So let's just move everything out of the way. So if we just pull in our sample block here. So I tend to start with the half square triangles, and I tend to try to use sort of different colours, but there's no hard and fast rules. And you want to do it so the half square triangles get laid out, if you think north, east, south, west, with the dark pointing towards each other. Now it needs a bit of brightness, so let's go and grab a red and add to that. So there's our north, east, south, west with colours pointing towards each other. Then I'm going to put my lights in, and the lights go down the centre. So I'm just going to grab 3 different lights. So I'm going to put that one in the centre, that one down the bottom, and then a plain one at the top. So these really are very scrappy blocks. And then we need 2 darks, and I try to go for something that sort of, let's go for a bright blue, that sort of lifts and sort of adds a bit more variety to the block, she says, and I'm going to put a brown there. So that's our block. So we're going to sew it. I always do right on to left. So let's just put a pin in. This is where I take it to the machine and get it all turned round. I'll try not to. Let's say at home I don't move the fabric about quite so much, but there we are. I'm going to put the pin where it needs to go. If you've got one of those design boards, these are perfect for this as well, because you can just lay it out and carry the whole thing over on a design board. And then that one. So I'm going to take that to the machine, and I'm going to take those 3 to the machine. Hopefully keeping them all in the right order. So as you can see, I didn't cut the thread there. I'm actually going to put those down there. Now press towards the squares. I'm just going to finger press for the moment, and then we can add that square there. Now at that point, rather than cutting thread, which I almost did, my finger went there and I thought, no, this is why I've brought these over, because we can actually, and this is what the leader end bit is, when you finish sewing, you can add something else through to sew. So I'm actually going to put through another bit for a half square triangle. And so as to leave it with something under the needle, I'm going to put another half square triangle through. So there's our block. And as well as doing our block, we're making some of the units, the half square triangles that are going into the block as we're assembling the block. And that's why this is going so quickly, because we're actually doing sort of bonus sewing, if you like. And I've been doing that in between doing my pineapple blocks. I've been making my half square triangle units and sewing them through. So that's why, as I said, this is going so quickly. So there's another one to add to our press open pile. So let's take that to the iron. Now, I don't do any fancy pressing with this. I just press to the squares, and then at the moment I'm pressing all the seams in one direction because I'm not quite sure what setting I'm going to do this yet. I haven't quite decided on layout, so I'm going to take that to the iron and just press all the seams to one side. So there's the block, and if I just turn it over, you can see there I've just gone all in one direction with those final two seams. So it's a really lovely block. I'm really pleased with it. It's a lovely bit of joyful sewing actually, and I'm really pleased because it's using up all those other bits that would otherwise just be sat languishing in my scrap stash for me to use one day. Well, the day is now. We're getting these used and we're getting these done. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed coming along right from the beginning of my process in terms of what I think and how I sort the scraps and what I'm starting to do. I think that is block number 21. So I've got another 27 blocks to make, but that means I'm almost halfway through, doesn't it? So that's looking pretty good. Now what I will do for you all is in the description, I will put the quantities that I'm doing, like I said, for each block, and then also for the 48 blocks, what the total quantities of each of those are going to be and the sizes, just so that you don't have to remember it all. So if you want to have a go with your scraps at doing this, you absolutely can. So thank you very much for joining us here today. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have, please do like, comment, share, subscribe, all of those wonderful things. And I hope you'll join us again here next time in the Sewing Studio.